You cannot catch it, but it can be caught when it is slow.
December 1944. A German fighter plummet toward Allied territory, trailing black smoke across the Belgian sky. Inside the cockpit, Major Hans Verner grips the stick with trembling hands, not from fear of death, but from the weight of what he's about to do. In minutes, he'll become either a traitor to the Reich or a bridge between enemies. Below him, certain capture. Behind him, his burning homeland. Ahead, Americans who shoot first, ask questions later. This is the moment everything changes. The morning of December 18, 1944, began like any other, at Rechlin Air Base, 90 kilometers north of Berlin.
You're clear for takeoff.
Ground crews worked in mechanical silence, their breath forming small clouds in the frozen air. The smell of high-octane fuel mixed with the acrid scent of burned rubber and metal, a perfume that every airman knew too well. Hans Verner stood before his Messerschmitt Bf 109 G14, running through his pre-flight checklist with the precision of a man who'd done this 1,000 times before. But nothing about this day was routine. At 32 years old, Hans was one of the Luftwaffe's most experienced test pilots. His logbook contained over 400 flight hours across 47 different aircraft types, from the graceful FW-190 to the revolutionary Me-262 jet fighter. He'd flown prototypes that hadn't yet received names-tested modifications that engineers swore would turn the tide of the war, and survived crashes that should have killed him 3 times over. His commanding officers called him Der Geist, the ghost, because he always came back. Today, he wasn't supposed to come back at all. The mission briefing had been simple: test a new fuel injection system designed to improve performance at high altitude. 30 minutes of flight time, standard protocols, return to base, sign the report. Except Hans had spent the previous night in the officers' quarters, staring at the ceiling, weighing a decision that would brand him either a coward or something he couldn't yet name. Oberst Friedrich Becker, the base commander, approached across the tarmac. He was a thick-set man in his 50s, a veteran of the previous war, who still carried shrapnel in his left leg. "Verner," he called out, "weather's turning. Make it quick." "Understood, sir." Hans saluted, his movements automatic, betraying nothing of the storm inside him. Becker paused, studying him with eyes that had seen too many young men die. "You look tired, Major. Something on your mind?" "Just thinking about Christmas, sir. My mother's alone in Dresden." A shadow passed over Becker's face. Everyone knew what was happening in Dresden. The firebombing rumors, the refugees flooding in from the east as the Red Army advanced. "We all have people we're worried about. Do your job. Get home safe. That's the best gift you can give her." Hans nodded, but the words felt like ash in his mouth. Safe. There was no safe anymore. Not in Germany. Not in Europe. Not in a world being torn apart by a madman's vision. As Becker walked away, Hans climbed into the cockpit. The leather seat was cold-worn smooth by countless flights. He strapped in with practiced efficiency, shoulder harness, lap, belt, oxygen mask. His hands moved through the startup sequence fuel pump on mixture-rich propeller full increase, throttle cracked open. The Daimler-Benz DB605 engine coughed once, twice, then roared to life with a sound like tearing metal. Tower clearance came through his headset. Luftwaffe 37, you are cleared for takeoff runway 20. Wind is 340 at 8 knots. Ceiling at 1,500 meters. 37 rolling. The Bf 109 accelerated down the concrete strip tail, coming up at 80 km/h wheels, leaving ground at 160. Hans retracted the landing gear and climbed into the gray December sky, watching the airbase shrink below him. From up here you couldn't see the desperation. You couldn't see the missing aircraft in the hangars. The skeletal maintenance crews working double shifts. The boys, and they were boys now, 17 and 18 years old, being rushed through training programs that used to take 2 years. At 3,000 meters, Hans leveled off and began the test sequence. The new fuel system performed flawlessly. Of course it did. German engineering was still magnificent, even as everything else crumbled. He made notes on his kneeboard recording manifold pressure, RPM, cylinder head temperature, all within acceptable ranges. Then he did something he'd never done before in nearly 3,000 hours of military flying. He reached down and manually shut off the fuel supply to the engine. The propeller continued windmilling for perhaps 3 seconds. Then silence, that terrible absolute silence that every pilot fears. The Bf-109 transformed instantly from a war machine into a glider, and not a particularly good one. Hans keyed his radio. Mayday, mayday, mayday. 37 experiencing engine failure. Attempting restart. He didn't attempt anything. Instead, he trimmed the aircraft for best glide speed and turned west. Toward Belgium. Toward American lines. The sky around him was empty. No fighters, no flak. Just clouds and the distant rumble of artillery from the Battle of the Bulge raging 50 kilometers south. Below, the landscape transformed from German farmland to contested territory to something that might be Allied-controlled. It was hard to tell anymore. The front lines shifted daily, hourly sometimes. His altimeter unwound 2,000 meters, 1,500, 1,000. This was the point of no return. He could still restart the engine. He had enough altitude, enough airspeed. He could turn back, claim mechanical failure, face nothing worse than some ribbing from his squadron mates. No one would know. No one would question. But Hans thought of Oberst Becker's words, "Do your job." What was his job? To test aircraft for a regime that had murdered millions, to enable a war machine that was losing anyway, dragging millions more to their deaths in its collapse, to pretend that following orders absolved him of what those orders made possible. 3 weeks ago, he'd been granted a rare leave to visit his mother in Dresden. He'd taken the train east, watching burned-out tanks and refugees moving in opposite directions. In Dresden, he'd found his childhood home largely intact, but his mother had aged a decade in the year since he'd last seen her. She told him about neighbors disappearing in the night, about whispered rumors from the camps, about the Jewish family that used to run the bakery on Pragerstrasse, gone all of them. "Hans," she'd said, gripping his hand with surprising strength, "when this is over, will you be able to live with what you've done?" "I'm a test pilot, Mama. I just fly the planes." "There's no just anymore, my boy. We're all part of this. Every one of us." At 500 meters, Hans spotted a clearing, a harvested field, with good approaches, no obstacles. He set up for landing, lowering flaps, slowing to stall speed, plus 10 knots. The ground rushed up. At the last second, he pulled back on the stick flaring, and the Bf-109 settled onto frozen mud with a jarring thump. The tail wheel collapsed, spinning the aircraft 90 degrees, but Hans was already hitting the release for his harness. He climbed out, legs shaky, and looked around. The field was bordered by a line of bare trees. Beyond them, a road. And on that road, moving toward him, with rifles raised, a patrol of American soldiers. Hans raised his hands above his head. The patrol's sergeant was a stocky man from Ohio named Miller, who'd been in Europe for 6 months and had seen too much to be surprised by anything anymore. Through a French-speaking private acting as interpreter, he asked the obvious question. "Engine failure." Hans understood enough English to answer directly. "Yes, engine failure." Miller studied him. The Iron Cross First Class, the pilot's badge, the rank insignia. "You're a test pilot?" "Yes." "Long way from your test range, Major." Hans said nothing. Miller spat into the frozen mud. "Well, you're our problem now. Strip off anything sharp, hand over your sidearm, and get in the truck. You just became a guest of the United States Army." As the truck bounced along rutted roads toward the rear lines, Hans stared at his hands. They weren't shaking anymore. For the first time in months, maybe years, he felt something like peace. Not happiness, not relief, just the simple certainty that he'd made a choice that was his own. He didn't know where he was going. He didn't know what would happen to him. But he knew this: he would never fly for the Reich again. The truck passed through the Belgian town of Liège, where local resistance fighters had painted Liberté on every wall the Germans hadn't burned. Children threw stones at the vehicle when they saw Hans's uniform. An old woman spat. Miller's men kept their rifles trained outward, protecting their prisoner from the very people they'd come to liberate. At a temporary POW processing center, a commandeered school building still showing blast damage. Hans was photographed, fingerprinted, and interrogated by a bored lieutenant who spoke textbook German and asked standard questions. Name, rank, unit commander. Hans answered everything truthfully. Why lie now? But when the lieutenant asked, "What aircraft have you flown?" Hans paused. Because that was the question that would change everything. I need to speak to someone in air intelligence, Hans said quietly. I have information about aircraft development programs, all of them. The lieutenant's boredom evaporated. Wait here. 20 minutes later, a captain arrived, older, sharper, with pilot's wings on his chest. He dismissed the guards and sat across from Hans, lighting a cigarette without offering one. I'm Captain Hendricks, Army Air Force's Technical Intelligence. You said you have information? I'm a test pilot for Erprobungsstelle Rechlin. Do you know what that is? Hendricks leaned forward. The Luftwaffe's main test center. We know of it. Then you know I've flown everything Germany has built or is building. The Me-262, the He-219, the Do-335, the rocket fighters, the jet bombers, all of it. The cigarette burned forgotten between Hendricks' fingers. Why are you telling me this? Hans met his eyes. Because the war is over. Germany just doesn't know it yet. Because I'm tired of being part of murder dressed up as duty. And because maybe the information I have can help end this faster and save lives on both sides. You understand you're describing treason against your country. My country committed treason against humanity. I'm just trying to find my way back. Hendricks stubbed out his cigarette and stood. You're going to America, Major Verner, and you're going to tell us everything. The C-47 transport that carried Hans across the Atlantic smelled of oil sweat and stale coffee. He sat shackled between two MPs who never spoke to him, watching America appear through scratched windows. First Newfoundland's rocky coast, then the impossibly green landscape of New England, finally the geometric precision of Ohio farmland, spreading toward the horizon like graph paper. Wright Field sprawled across 400-500 acres outside Dayton, a city Hans had never heard of until Captain Hendricks mentioned it during the flight. The base housed the Air Technical Service Command, America's answer to Rechlin, but on a scale that made Hans's chest tighten. As the truck drove through the main gate on December 28th, he counted 47 aircraft on the flight line. Everything from training biplanes to the new B-29 Super Fortress. More planes in one place than he'd seen in Germany in 6 months. They brought him to Building 11, a brick structure that could have been a school or a hospital, except for the armed guards at every entrance. Inside the hallways, gleamed with fresh paint and fluorescent lighting, luxuries that felt obscene after years of blackouts and rationing. An administrative sergeant processed him with mechanical efficiency fingerprints, again medical examination, clothing exchange. The American uniform they gave him had no insignia, just a white PW stenciled on the back. That stands for prisoner of war, in case you're wondering, the sergeant said without malice. You'll wear it until Lieutenant Colonel Watson decides otherwise. Hans didn't ask who Watson was. He'd find out soon enough. The cell was 6 paces by 8, with a cot bolted to the wall, a steel toilet, and a single window reinforced with wire mesh. A guard delivered 3 meals, daily portions larger than anything Hans had seen in a year. Eggs, real coffee, bread without sawdust. He ate mechanically, unable to reconcile abundance with captivity. For 3 days, no one came. No interrogation, no questions, just meals and silence. The isolation was deliberate, Hans knew. They were softening him, letting him imagine what might happen, letting fear do the work before they asked a single question. He'd seen Gestapo use similar techniques. The waiting was always worse than the questioning. On the 4th day, January 2nd, 1945, A guard unlocked his cell at 0700 hours. "Come with me." They walked down corridors that smelled of floor wax and typewriter ribbon, past offices where American officers did paperwork behind glass doors. Ordinary work, bureaucratic work. The machinery of a nation that could afford bureaucracy because it wasn't burning. The interrogation room was smaller than Hans expected, just a table, 3 chairs, and walls painted institutional beige. But there was a coffee pot on a hot plate in the corner, and real ceramic cups instead of paper. Someone was trying to signal something. The door opened and a man entered who changed everything Hans thought he understood about his situation. Lieutenant Colonel Harold Watson was 41 years old, though his graying temples made him look older. He wore pilot's wings, a test pilot's insignia, and an expression of focused curiosity that Hans recognized instantly. This was a man who thought in 3 dimensions, who understood lift and drag, and the moment when an aircraft stops being machinery and becomes an extension of will. Watson sat down without introducing himself and poured 2 cups of coffee. "Cream sugar." Hans blinked. "Excuse me. In your coffee, do you take anything in it?" "Black is fine." Watson pushed a cup across the table and took a long sip from his own. "I've been reading your file, Major Verner. Impressive record. 400 hours, 47 aircraft types. You flew the Me-262 at Lechfeld in August 44, is that correct?" The question was casual, but Hans heard the trap. Admit to flying the jet fighter, and he confirmed classified intelligence. Deny it, and he was useless. He chose a third option. "What did Captain Hendricks tell you?" "That you volunteered information. That you claimed to have knowledge of advanced development programs. That you wanted to end the war faster." Watson set down his cup. "I'm here to find out if any of that is true. And if it is, then we talk, really talk, not interrogation conversation, pilot to pilot." Watson leaned back. "I flew B-17s over Germany in 43 before they pulled me for test work. Took flak over Schweinfurt. Lost an engine over Bremen. I've seen what your side can do from the receiving end, so I know what I'm asking when I say tell me how the Me-262 handles." Hans stared at the coffee steam rising between them. This was the moment. Once he started talking, there was no going back. Every word would be betrayal or redemption depending on who was judging. "It's like comparing a rifle to a bow," Hans said quietly. "Everything you know about propeller aircraft, forget it. The acceleration is violent. The turning radius at speed is poor because there's no propeller wash over the control surfaces. But once you understand the energy management, once you stop trying to dogfight and start thinking in terms of boom and zoom passes," he looked up, "it's the future. And your pilots aren't ready for it." Watson didn't move. "Go on." "The P-51 is a beautiful aircraft, truly. Long range, good handling, reliable. But it's still playing by 1942 rules. The 262 makes those rules obsolete. Your fighter pilots think in terms of turning combat, getting on the enemy's 6 and staying there. Against a jet, that thinking will get them killed. So how do we beat it? You don't. Not one-on-one." Hans wrapped his hands around the coffee cup, grateful for its warmth. "You use numbers. You catch them during takeoff or landing when they're slow. You exploit the fact that we're running out of fuel, out of trained pilots, out of time. But if you're asking me how to fight the Me-262 in a fair engagement," he shook his head, "there is no fair engagement. That's the whole point." Watson pulled out a notebook and began writing. "What about the He-219? We've heard rumors but have no confirmed intelligence." And just like that, they were no longer captor and prisoner. They were 2 professionals discussing problems that transcended flags and politics. Hans talked about the Heinkel night fighter's handling characteristics, its radar system, the ingenious ejection seats that had saved his life during a test flight in June. Watson asked technical questions that proved he understood not just flying, but engineering, the kind of questions that couldn't be faked. 2 hours passed, then 4. A guard brought sandwiches and fresh coffee. Watson sent him away, telling him they weren't to be disturbed. Tell me about the Do 335, Watson said, consulting a list. Push-pull configuration correct. Yes. Propellers front and rear. Hans allowed himself a small smile. It looks absurd, like someone couldn't decide which way the plane should face, but it's fast over 750 kilometers per hour in level flight, faster than your P-51 at similar altitude. The problem is production. We completed maybe 40 airframes before resources ran out. Beautiful engineering useless for war. Why useless? Because war isn't about the best design. It's about the design you can build in quantity, maintain in the field, and replace when it's destroyed. Your P-51 isn't the best fighter in the sky, but you can build 10,000 of them. That's what wins. Watson stopped writing and looked at him with something like respect. That's strategic thinking, not tactical. They teach that at test pilot school. They teach that in burning cities. They teach that when you fly over refugees streaming west away from the Russians. They teach that when your fuel allowance gets cut in half, then cut again, and you realize the Luftwaffe has become a museum of magnificent failures. The words came harder now, tinged with bitterness Hans hadn't known he was carrying. We had the best engineers in the world, still do, but we wasted them on Hitler's fantasies, America bomber projects that could never work, rocket planes with 3 minutes of fuel, jets that needed engines rebuilt after 10 hours. We innovated ourselves into irrelevance while you mass-produced victory. Watson was quiet for a long moment. That's an unusual perspective for a German officer. I stopped being a German officer when I shut off my fuel pump over Belgium. Now, I'm just a pilot who's tired of watching genius serve madness. And what do you think you're serving now? The question landed like a punch. Hans set down his coffee cup carefully. I'm trying to serve the idea that engineering should build, not destroy. That knowledge should survive, even if nations don't. That maybe if I explain how these machines work, your pilots can defend against them with less dying on both sides. He met Watson's eyes. Is that serving you? Yes. Does that make me a traitor? Ask me in 10 years when I can sleep without seeing the faces of people I've killed. Watson closed his notebook. I'm recommending that you be transferred to active technical advisory status. That means you'll be moved to better quarters, given supervised access to our aircraft, and asked to provide detailed briefings to our test pilots and engineers. It also means every word you say, every flight you make will be documented and analyzed. You'll be helping us defeat the country you served for 12 years. I understand. Do you? Because once we start this, there's no going back. You won't be a prisoner anymore, you'll be a collaborator. And if Germany somehow wins this war, you'll be executed as a traitor. Are you prepared for that? Hans thought of his mother in Dresden, of the Jewish bakery family, of Oberst Becker asking him to come home safe, of the 17-year-old pilots being rushed through training to die in planes they didn't know how to fly. Colonel Watson, Germany already lost this war. We lost it in 1941 when we invaded Russia. Everything since then has been dying slowly. I can't stop that. But maybe I can stop some of the dying. That's all I'm prepared for, trying to make the ending less terrible than it has to be. Watson stood and extended his hand. Hans stared at it for 3 heartbeats before taking it. Welcome to Wright Field, Major. Or should I call you something else now? Hans. Just Hans. Over the next 3 weeks, Hans lived in a strange twilight between prisoner and colleague. They moved him to a small apartment in the bachelor officers' quarters, still guarded, still monitored, but with a real bed and a radio and books in English he struggled to read. Every morning at EO 800, a jeep drove him to the flight test division, where he spent hours in briefing rooms, filled with American pilots, engineers, and intelligence officers. The questions never stopped. What's the stall speed of the TON-52? How does the FW-190's radial engine compare to the BF-109's inline? What modifications did Messerschmitt make between the 262 A1A and A2A variants? How effective is the R4M rocket system? What training did Luftwaffe pilots receive for jet transition? Hans answered everything. He drew diagrams. He corrected their assumptions. He explained not just what German aircraft could do, but why they were designed that way, what compromises were made where the weak points existed. The Americans were hungry for knowledge in a way that moved him. They didn't just want data, they wanted understanding. They wanted to know how German pilots thought, how German engineers approached problems, what philosophical differences separated Luftwaffe doctrine from Army Air Force's tactics. And slowly, Hans began to realize something that both relieved and frightened him. These men didn't hate him. They were wary, yes. Suspicious, certainly, but they respected competence and expertise regardless of which flag it had served. To them, he wasn't an enemy, he was a resource. A window into a world they'd only encountered at 20,000 feet through gun sights and flak bursts. On January 24th, Watson appeared in the briefing room with a different expression. Something between excitement and concern. "We need to talk privately." They walked to Watson's office, a cramped space filled with technical manuals and aircraft photographs. Watson closed the door and lit a cigarette without sitting down. "I've been authorized to offer you something unprecedented. We want you to fly our aircraft, not as a prisoner, but as a technical consultant. Full evaluation flights with our test pilots observing your technique and gathering your feedback." Hans felt his breath catch. "You want me to fly American fighters? Starting with the P-51, then the P-47, P-38, and if you prove trustworthy, the P-80 jet. We need to know what a German pilot sees when he faces these aircraft. We need to understand our own blind spots. And you trust me to do this honestly?" Watson exhaled smoke. "No, but I trust that you're smart enough to know that lying would end the arrangement immediately. And I trust that you still love flying enough to tell the truth about what you experience up there." He stubbed out the cigarette. "Am I wrong?" Hans thought about the moment his Bf-109's propeller stopped windmilling over Belgium. The silence before the choice, the weight of every decision that followed. "When do I start?" "Tomorrow, 0900. Wear a flight suit, not a uniform." And Hans. Watson's expression softened slightly. "Welcome back to the sky." That night, alone in his guarded apartment, Hans stood at the window, looking toward the flight line where rows of American fighters sat ready for dawn. Somewhere across the Atlantic, men were dying in the rubble of his homeland. Somewhere, the war ground on without him. But here, impossibly, he'd found something he thought he'd lost forever: purpose without ideology, service without murder, and the chance to do with knowledge what he'd failed to do with silence. He didn't sleep. He couldn't. Tomorrow he would fly again. Not as an enemy, not as a prisoner, but as something new, something without a name yet. The P-51D Mustang sat on the tarmac like a promise made in aluminum and rivets. Hans circled it slowly on the morning of January 25th, his boots crunching on frost-hardened concrete, trying to reconcile the machine before him with the nightmares it had caused. He'd seen Mustangs before, through gun sights, through cockpit glass, while diving away at full throttle in the debriefing reports that listed names of pilots who hadn't come back. Now he was supposed to climb inside one. Watson stood beside the wing with two other test pilots, Captain Robert King and Lieutenant James Hoover, both watching Hans with expressions carefully emptied of judgment. King had flown combat missions over France. Hoover had lost a brother to flak over Hamburg. Neither man had volunteered for this assignment, but both had accepted it because Watson asked. "She's all yours," Watson said, gesturing to the cockpit. "Walk me through your pre-flight." Hans ran his hands along the wing's leading edge, feeling for imperfections his eyes might miss. The metal was smoother than German aircraft, the panel gaps tighter. Everything precision manufactured with tolerances that spoke of factories untouched by bombs. He checked the control surfaces, testing for play in the hinges. Walked around to examine the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine through the cowling gaps. "You build them well," he said quietly. "We build them fast," King corrected. North American Aviation produced 15,000 of these. How many 262s did Messerschmitt complete? Perhaps 400, maybe less. Hans pulled himself onto the wing and peered into the cockpit. Everything was different gauge placement throttle quadrant configuration, even the smell of the interior. American leather, and American paint, and American confidence. But production doesn't win dogfights. The pilot does. Then show us how a German pilot thinks. Hoover set his voice flat. That's why you're here. Hans settled into the seat and immediately understood why American pilots loved this aircraft. The visibility was extraordinary, the canopy offering an unobstructed view that made a Bf-109's narrow greenhouse feel claustrophobic by comparison. He ran through the start sequence with Watson calling out each step, correcting his errors, teaching him the machine's language. The Merlin caught on the first attempt its distinctive growl, different from the harsh bark of a Daimler-Benz. Hans let it warm while scanning instruments, committing numbers to memory. Oil pressure climbing. Coolant temperature stabilizing. Everything about this aircraft whispered of reliability, of engineering philosophy that prioritized the pilot getting home over the pilot achieving one more kill. Wright Tower, this is Test 59er with 1 P-51 requesting taxi. Watson's voice came through the headset. Remember Hans' gentle inputs. She's responsive but forgiving. Don't fight her. Hans taxied to runway 23, running final checks with hands that had flown 47 aircraft types but still trembled slightly. Not from fear, from something else. Anticipation, maybe, or the strangeness of sitting in a machine that had been built to kill him, now trusting him with its secrets. Test 59er. You're cleared for takeoff. Wind 230 at 6 knots. Have a good flight. He pushed the throttle forward, and the Mustang surged acceleration, pressing him into the seat with force that felt almost aggressive compared to the 109's more gradual power buildup. The tail came up without prompting. At 90 knots, the aircraft wanted to fly. Hans eased back on the stick and felt the wheels leave. Earth felt the familiar transformation from ground-bound machine to something that belonged to the sky. He climbed to 8,000 feet and began the evaluation sequence Watson had outlined. Straight and level flight, first checking, trim stability control response. The Mustang flew with an ease that bordered on laziness, requiring minimal input to maintain heading and altitude. A pilot could fly this for hours without fatigue. A German pilot in a 109 fought the aircraft, constantly wrestling with torque and gyroscopic precession. This was the difference between engineering for endurance and engineering for performance. Hans rolled into a series of turns, pulling progressively tighter, feeling where the aircraft wanted to be and where it resisted. At 4 Gs, the wings protested but held. At 5, the airframe shuddered but didn't break. He reversed, rolling from right bank to left, and the Mustang followed with a crispness that made him understand why American pilots dove into furball engagements while Germans increasingly tried to avoid them. "How's she handling?" Watson's voice crackled through the radio. "Like you designed it for pilots who might make mistakes and deserve to survive them anyway." A pause. Then Watson's laugh, genuine and surprised. "That's exactly what we did. Run through some stalls for me. Clean configuration first, then approach." Hans climbed to 10,000 feet and began bleeding off airspeed. The Mustang gave ample warning before the stall, buffeting mushiness in the controls, every indication that disaster was approaching. When it finally broke, it was gentle, almost apologetic. Nose-dropped wings, stayed level, recovery was intuitive. He tried it again, with flaps and gear down. Same result, forgiving, predictable, pilot-friendly. A Bf-109 stalled like it was personally offended you'd let it get slow. The wing would drop without warning, snapping into a spin that required immediate corrective action. Pilots died during training because they didn't react fast enough. This aircraft practically coached you through the recovery. "What are you thinking?" Watson asked. Hans keyed the mic. "I'm thinking that if we'd had this engine in 1940, the war would have ended differently. But more than that, I'm thinking you designed this for average pilots to become good pilots. We designed ours for good pilots to become dead heroes. Explain that. The 109 reward skill. Perfect technique, perfect timing, and you can outmaneuver almost anything. But one mistake and it kills you. This? Hans executed a chandelle climbing turn that transitioned smoothly into level flight. This rewards persistence. Your pilots can make mistakes, learn from them, and come back tomorrow to try again. It's not romantic, it's practical. And in a long war, practical always wins. He spent another 40 minutes exploring the Mustang's performance envelope, high-speed dives to test compressibility, energy management maneuvers, simulated combat scenarios against imaginary opponents. The aircraft had weaknesses. It didn't accelerate as quickly as a 109 in a climb. The roll rate at low speeds was pedestrian, and the wing loading meant it bled energy in sustained turns. But those weaknesses were predictable, manageable part of a coherent design philosophy. Landing was almost disappointingly easy. The Mustang settled onto the runway with minimal float, the wide-track landing gear keeping it stable through touchdown and rollout. Hans taxied back to the hangar where Watson and his team waited with notebooks and cameras ready to document every observation. They spent 3 hours debriefing. Hans explained what he'd felt, what surprised him, what concerned him. The Americans scribbled notes, asked follow-up questions, occasionally challenged his interpretations. It was the most honest conversation about aircraft performance Hans had experienced in years. No propaganda, no wishful thinking, just professionals trying to understand reality. "Tomorrow you'll fly the P-47, Watson said as the session wrapped up. "Heavier aircraft, different mission profile. Day after that, the P-38 if weather permits. And if I told you the P-38's counter-rotating propellers make it too complex for mass production, that you're wasting resources on a design that looks impressive but offers marginal tactical advantage." King bristled. "The 38 has excellent range and firepower. And almost no one uses it effectively," Hans interrupted. "I've flown against them. They're intimidating until you realize the pilots don't trust the aircraft. They think they're flying two planes bolted together. You feel it in how they maneuver, hesitant, cautious, never committing fully to an attack." He looked at Watson. "Am I wrong?" Watson exchanged glances with his colleagues. "No, you're not. But fly it anyway, and tell us if you see a way to fix the problem, or if we should just move production capacity elsewhere." Over the next 12 days, Hans flew 17 evaluation flights across 6 different aircraft types. The P-47 Thunderbolt, brutally powerful, capable of absorbing punishment, that would shred a German fighter, but heavy enough that any pilot who let it get slow was already dead. The P-38 Lightning, exactly as problematic as he'd predicted, beautiful and frustrating in equal measure. The P-40 Warhawk, obsolescent but still deadly in the right hands, optimized for a war that had already moved past it. Each flight was followed by hours of debriefing. Each debrief revealed more about American tactical thinking, training programs, maintenance philosophy. Hans found himself not just evaluating aircraft, but analyzing an entire military aviation system from factory floor to frontline squadron, from basic flight training to combat doctrine. "You're thinking strategically again," Watson observed during a break on February 3rd. They were in the hangar watching mechanics service a P-80 jet fighter that Hans hadn't yet been cleared to fly. "That's not test pilot thinking. That's staff officer thinking. Maybe I'm trying to understand how you're winning a war with aircraft that aren't individually superior to ours." "Are we winning?" Hans watched a crew chief inspect the P-80's jet engine with methodical care. "Yes, because you've built a system. Training that produces adequate pilots quickly. Maintenance procedures that keep aircraft flying. Supply chains that deliver parts before they're needed. We built beautiful machines and assumed that was enough. You built an entire infrastructure around adequate machines and made that unstoppable." Watson lit a cigarette, offering the pack to Hans, who declined. "There's a briefing tomorrow morning. Joint Intelligence and Army Air Forces Command. They want you there." To say what? To tell them how to fight the Me-262 in combat. We're starting to encounter them over Germany. Pilots are scared. They don't know what they're facing. Hans felt his stomach tighten. You want me to help kill Luftwaffe pilots? I want you to help American pilots survive encounters with an aircraft you know better than anyone alive. Or have you forgotten why you're here? The briefing room on February 4th held 37 officers, pilots, intelligence analysts, squadron commanders rotating back from Europe. They watched Hans enter with expressions ranging from curiosity to open hostility. A POW, even a cooperative one, was still a POW. The man sitting third row left had a scar running from temple to jawline, flak damage from a mission Hans might have flown. Watson made brief introductions, establishing context without apology. Major Verner has more hours in German jets than anyone outside Germany. He's going to explain what you're up against and how to stay alive. I suggest you listen. Hans stood at the front of the room and decided that pretending to be anything other than what he was would be worse than honesty. I don't expect you to like me, he began. I've flown against your friends, maybe killed some of them. That's the truth we're starting with. But I'm here because I believe this war needs to end, and it will end faster if your pilots understand what they're fighting. He moved to the blackboard and sketched the Me-262's profile from memory. This aircraft is faster than anything you fly. In a straight line, you cannot catch it. In a dive, you cannot follow it. It has 4 30mm cannon that will destroy you with a single burst. If you try to dogfight it using conventional tactics, you will die. The room was utterly silent. But it has weaknesses. The engines are unreliable. They flame out unpredictably. The aircraft is vulnerable during takeoff and landing when it's slow. The pilot's visibility is poor compared to your Mustangs. And most critically, most of the pilots flying them now are inexperienced. They've been rushed through training because we're running out of veterans. They know the aircraft is fast, but don't understand energy management. They make mistakes. Hans drew approach vectors on the board. You catch them here during final approach, or here just after takeoff when they're accelerating but not yet at combat speed. You work in pairs, one high, one low. You use altitude advantage and numbers. You never ever try to turn with them at high speed. A captain in the second row raised his hand. What about head-on passes? Suicide for both of you. The 262's cannon will kill you before you're in effective range. Even if you survive, the closing speed makes accurate shooting almost impossible. So, we're supposed to just avoid them? No. You're supposed to be smarter than them. Use your aircraft's advantages: better low-speed handling, better visibility, better reliability. Force them to fight your fight, not theirs. And remember that every minute they're in the air burns fuel they can't replace. Time is on your side. Patience is your weapon. For 2 hours, Hans answered questions, drew diagrams, explained tactics he'd developed and tactics he'd seen work against German jets. He told them about the 262's tendency to leak fuel, its problematic landing gear, the way inexperienced pilots panicked when the engines spooled down during descent. He told them how to kill the machine he'd helped perfect. Afterward, as the room emptied, the captain with the facial scar approached. His name tag read Morrison. My bombardier died over Regensburg. Morrison said, his voice careful. He was 22. Navigator was wounded so badly, he'll never walk again. That was your side. Yes. So why should I believe anything you just told us? Hans met his eyes. Because I'm trying to stop being part of the killing, and because everything I said in there is true. You can verify it the next time you encounter a 262. If I'm lying, you'll know. If I'm right, maybe your crew survives. That's the only answer I have. Morrison studied him for a long moment, then nodded once and left. Watson appeared at Hans's elbow. That was harder than flying, wasn't it? Flying doesn't require you to face what you've done. It just requires you to face what comes next. And what comes next for you? Hans looked at the blackboard where tactical diagrams still marked the best ways to destroy an aircraft he'd once believed might save Germany. I don't know. But it won't include pretending I haven't helped build machines designed for murder, even if I'm trying to unmake that now. That night alone again in his guarded quarters, Hans lay awake thinking about the pilots who'd listened to his briefing. American boys, most of them barely older than the German teenagers, being sent up in jets they didn't know how to fly. On both sides, young men dying because old men had decided their nation's pride mattered more than their lives. He'd flown the enemy's machines and found them honest built to bring pilots home, not to chase glory. He'd shared his expertise and felt the weight of every word, knowing each tactical insight might save an American life and cost a German one. There was no redemption in this, he realized. No washing away of what he'd been part of. But there was something else, the stubborn insistence that knowledge should serve life rather than death. That understanding across battle lines was possible, even when forgiveness wasn't. Tomorrow, Watson wanted him to fly the P-80 jet, America's answer to the 262. Tomorrow, he'd sit in another aircraft built by his enemy and tell them its secrets. Tomorrow, he'd continue becoming something he still couldn't name. Not quite traitor, not quite ally. Just a man trying to make the ending less terrible than it had to be. Outside his window, the Wright Field flight line glowed under sodium lights, row after row of American aircraft waiting for dawn. Somewhere across the Atlantic, the war ground on. But here, impossibly in the space between prisoner and colleague, Hans had found a kind of purpose. It wasn't the sky he'd expected to reach when his engine failed over Belgium, but it was the one he'd chosen to serve. The P-80 Shooting Star represented everything Hans had feared and everything he'd hoped to find in American aviation. On February 8th, as ground crews towed the jet from its hangar, he stood watching it with the conflicted feelings of a man about to fly the future he'd helped make inevitable. The aircraft's lines were cleaner than the Me-262, its single engine mounted internally rather than hung beneath the wings, its design speaking of lessons learned rather than desperate improvisation. Watson handed him the flight manual, 300 pages of technical specifications and procedures. "You've got 2 days to memorize this. Then we fly." Hans spent those days doing nothing but reading, eating, and sleeping. The P-80's systems were both familiar and alien jet engine principles he understood intimately, but implemented with American engineering philosophy that prioritized reliability over raw performance. The manual included failure procedures the Me-262's handbook had never bothered to document, because German engineers assumed their pilots would simply die if systems failed. On February 10th, he flew America's jet fighter for the first time. The acceleration was brutal, but smooth, without the Me-262's tendency to yaw violently as the engines spooled up. Hans climbed through 15,000 feet, feeling the aircraft respond to inputs with precision that bordered on telepathic. This was what the 262 should have been if Germany had possessed unlimited resources, mature jet engine technology, and 2 more years of development time it didn't have. He pushed the throttle to maximum and felt the airspeed climb past 500 miles per hour. At this speed, propeller aircraft became irrelevant. The sky belonged to jets now, and wars would be fought by whoever could build them faster and fly them better. "How does she compare?" Watson's voice crackled through the radio. Hans thought about how to answer honestly. "The 262 is faster in straight line speed, maybe 50 kilometers per hour advantage. But this..." He rolled into a high-speed turn, feeling the G-forces build without the airframe shuddering the way German jets did. This is what happens when you have time to solve problems instead of just accepting them. He spent 90 minutes exploring the P-80's capabilities, finding its limits, understanding its personality. When he landed, Watson was waiting with a telegram in his hand and an expression that Hans couldn't quite read. "Germany's collapsing," Watson said without preamble. "Dresden was bombed 3 days ago. Firestorm. Casualty estimates are in the tens of thousands. I'm sorry." Hans felt his legs weaken. "My mother lives in Dresden. I know. I checked your file after I heard." Watson handed him the telegram. Red Cross is trying to confirm civilian casualties. It'll take weeks, maybe months. The paper trembled in Hans's hands. He couldn't read the words. They blurred into meaningless shapes while his mind tried to process what Dresden burning meant. His mother's apartment was near the Altstadt, the old city center, where medieval buildings stood packed together like kindling. If the firestorm had reached that far, she would have had no chance. I need to sit down. Watson guided him to a bench outside the hangar. Take all the time you need. But there was no time that would make this different. No amount of sitting would change the fact that Hans had chosen to help America while America burned his mother alive. The logic didn't work that way. His defection hadn't caused the bombing, his information hadn't selected the targets. But logic meant nothing against the image of his mother's face the last time he'd seen her aged and worried, telling him there was no just anymore. Did I do this? Hans asked quietly. No. Strategic bombing decisions are made at levels far above anything you've influenced. Dresden was chosen for military and political reasons that have nothing to do with you. But I'm helping. Every flight I make, every briefing I give, I'm helping the people who did this. Watson sat beside him. You're helping end a war your own government started. A war that's killed millions and would kill millions more if it continued. I can't tell you that makes it easier. I can't tell you there's a clean choice here. But you decided in December what you believed was right. Don't let grief make you forget why you decided it. Hans looked at the telegram again, forcing himself to read the clinical language. Extensive damage to residential areas. Casualty verification ongoing. All inquiries should be directed to... He folded it carefully and put it in his pocket. When can I fly again? You don't have to. When can I fly again? Watson studied him. Tomorrow, if you're sure. I'm not sure of anything except that sitting still will destroy me faster than flying will. That evening, Hans wrote a letter to the Red Cross inquiring about Frau Elisabeth Verner, last known address, Prager Strasse, 47 Dresden. He included every detail he could remember: his mother's age, physical description, the neighbors' names, the bakery where she shopped before the Jewish family disappeared. He wrote it in careful English, aware that a German POW's letter might receive low priority, aware that by the time anyone processed his request, his mother might be nothing but ashes in a mass grave. He sealed the letter and gave it to the guard who monitored his quarters. Then he sat at the small desk and wrote a second letter, this one in German, to no one who would ever read it. Mama, I don't know if you're alive. I don't know if you died thinking I betrayed you, betrayed Germany, betrayed everything you raised me to be. But I need you to understand something even if you never read this. I didn't defect because I stopped loving my country. I defected because I couldn't keep serving what my country had become. There's a difference. I hope you would understand that difference. I hope you would forgive me for choosing humanity over nationalism. I hope you're alive to hate me for it. He never sent the second letter. It stayed in his desk drawer, one more piece of a past he couldn't escape and couldn't return to. February became March. The war news grew worse daily. Germany surrounded cities, following the Reich, shrinking into an ever smaller circle of destruction. Hans flew almost every day, evaluating aircraft, briefing pilots, contributing to the machinery that was crushing his homeland. Each flight felt like betrayal and redemption simultaneously, and he'd stopped trying to reconcile the contradiction. On March 15th, Watson called him into a conference room where 5 men in uniforms Hans didn't recognize waited around a table covered with photographs and maps. These are officers from 8th Air Force Intelligence, Watson explained. They have questions about Luftwaffe pilot training programs. Specifically, they need to understand how Germany is managing to put pilots in jets with minimal experience. For 3 hours, Hans described the collapse of German training infrastructure, how flight schools had been bombed or moved repeatedly, how fuel shortages meant student pilots received a fraction of the training hours he'd gotten, how instructors were pulled back to combat duty, leaving barely qualified pilots to teach even less qualified students, how the Luftwaffe was sending boys into combat with 20 hours of jet time and calling it adequate, They're killing their own pilots faster than we are, one of the intelligence officers said. Yes, Hans agreed. The Tu-62 requires skill to fly safely. Without proper training, pilots make fatal errors. Engine management, energy conservation approach procedures, everything is less forgiving than propeller aircraft. We're losing more pilots to accidents than to combat. Hans caught himself. They are losing pilots. But the slip revealed something he'd been trying to ignore. Despite everything, despite defection, despite cooperation, despite Dresden burning, part of him still thought in terms of we when discussing the Luftwaffe. Identity couldn't be switched off like a fuel pump. He was helping America while still carrying Germany inside him, and the contradiction was tearing him apart. After the intelligence officers left, Watson poured 2 glasses of bourbon from a bottle he kept in his desk drawer. He handed one to Hans without asking if he wanted it. I got word from the Red Cross this morning about your mother. Hans set down the glass without drinking. Is she dead? They don't know. Dresden's records are chaos. But they found a woman matching your mother's description in a refugee camp near Leipzig. She was registered 3 days after the bombing. The age is right. The name is similar but not exact, listed as Elizabeth Verner instead of Werner. Could be a transcription error. Hope was worse than certainty. Hope meant imagining possibilities, meant allowing himself to believe she'd survived while knowing he might be wrong. Hans picked up the bourbon and drank it in one swallow. How do I find out for sure? You can't. Not until the war ends and records get sorted. Maybe not even then. I'm sorry. But there's a reasonable chance she's alive. Hans stared at the empty glass. If she is alive, she's in a refugee camp because American bombers destroyed her city. And I'm here helping those bombers' crews become more effective. How do I live with that? The same way I live with knowing my bombs killed German civilians who never wanted this war. The same way every soldier lives with it. You accept that war makes everyone complicit in things they'd never choose individually, and you try to shorten the killing any way you can. Watson refilled Hans's glass. You think you're unique? You think you're the only man in this war who's had to choose between bad options. Every pilot who's dropped bombs on cities, every soldier who's followed orders, he found morally questionable. Every person who survived while others died. We're all living with contradictions we can't resolve. You just have to decide if your contradiction serves something larger than your guilt. The bourbon burned less on the second drink. And if it doesn't, then you're just another casualty. Just one who's still breathing. April brought spring to Ohio and the final collapse of Nazi Germany. Hans listened to radio reports describing the encirclement of the Ruhr, the Americans crossing the Rhine, the Soviets closing on Berlin. Each broadcast was a countdown to an ending that would leave him stateless. Neither German nor American, neither prisoner nor free citizen, suspended in a status the Geneva Convention had never anticipated. On April 12th, President Roosevelt died. The American officers at Wright Field walked around stunned, uncertain how to process the loss. Hans found himself oddly moved by their grief, by the genuine affection they felt for a leader he'd been taught to call an enemy. It was another reminder that nations were just collections of people, and people grieved regardless of which flag they served. On April 30th, news arrived that Hitler had committed suicide in his Berlin bunker. Watson came to Hans's quarters personally to deliver the information. It's over, Watson said. Maybe not officially, but over. Germany will surrender within days. Hans sat on his bed, trying to feel something about the death of the man who'd destroyed his country. He felt nothing. Hitler had become irrelevant months ago, maybe years ago. The war had taken on its own momentum, and removing the madman at its center changed nothing for the millions already dead or dying. What happens to me now? That's complicated. You're technically a prisoner of war, but you've been providing technical assistance that probably qualifies as collaboration. The Pentagon is trying to figure out your legal status. Some want to prosecute you for treason against Germany. Others want to offer you employment. It's unprecedented. I'm a man without a country. Maybe. Or maybe you're a man who gets to choose his country for the first time in his life instead of having it chosen for him by birth. Watson pulled a chair close and sat down. The Army Air Forces wants to hire you. Civilian test pilot position. Full salary, security clearance, the works. You'd continue doing exactly what you've been doing, but without the prisoner status. What do you think? Hans thought about his mother alive or dead in the ruins of Germany. He thought about the American pilots he'd briefed the enemy aircraft he'd flown, the impossible situation of helping one side destroy the other. He thought about the fact that he was 32 years old and couldn't imagine returning to whatever Germany would become after surrender. I think I stopped being German the day I shut off my fuel pump. I think I'll never be American no matter how many years I live here. But I think the sky doesn't care about citizenship, and maybe that's enough. Is that a yes? It's an acknowledgement that I don't have better options, so yes. On May 7th, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was over. At Wright Field, there was cautious celebration, pilots opening bottles of champagne, officers shaking hands, everyone aware that the Pacific War continued, but allowing themselves to mark the moment anyway. Hans spent the evening alone in his quarters, listening to surrender broadcasts in German on a borrowed radio. He heard Donitz's voice announcing the end, heard the formal language trying to make defeat sound like something other than total collapse. He wondered if his mother was listening to the same broadcast somewhere in a refugee camp. He wondered if she was alive to hear it at all. The next morning, Watson brought paperwork, contracts, security agreements, employment terms. Hans signed everything with the mechanical precision of a man who'd stopped questioning his choices because questioning led nowhere except deeper confusion. You're officially a civilian employee of the United States Army Air Forces, Watson said, watching Hans initial the last page. Congratulations. You're probably the strangest hire we've ever made. Do I get an American uniform? No uniform. Civilian clothes. You'll work alongside military test pilots, but you're not military anymore. You're just... Watson paused, searching for words. You're just Hans Verner, pilot. That's all. Just Hans Verner. Not German. Not American. Not prisoner. Not traitor. Just a man who flew aircraft and tried to survive the wreckage of a world that had destroyed itself. 3 weeks later, a letter arrived from the Red Cross. Hans stared at it for 5 minutes before opening it, terrified of what it might contain. Dear Mr. Verner, we have confirmed the location of Elizabeth Verner, believed to be Elizabeth Verner, at a displaced persons camp near Leipzig, American occupation zone. She is listed in fair health considering circumstances. We have forwarded your inquiry to camp administrators. Further correspondence may be possible pending clearance and postal service restoration. She was alive. Hans read the letter 3 times, then folded it carefully and placed it in the drawer with the unsent letter he'd written in February. His mother was alive, and he was in America, and between them lay an ocean and choices that couldn't be unmade. He went to the flight line and stood looking at the rows of aircraft, American machines he'd learned to fly, American technology he'd helped improve, American power he'd served while his own country burned. The contradiction remained unresolved. Maybe it always would. But his mother was alive, and that had to mean something. That had to mean the choices he'd made, however terrible, however compromised, had served some purpose beyond his own survival. Watson found him there an hour later. You heard, she's alive. That's good news. Is it? She's in a camp. Germany's divided between occupiers. I'm here. What am I supposed to do with good news I can't act on? Watson lit a cigarette and offered the pack. This time Hans took one. You keep flying, you keep working, you keep being useful until the world settles enough that you can figure out what comes next. That's all any of us can do. They stood together in silence, watching mechanics service an aircraft for tomorrow's test flight. The war was over, but Hans's war, the private war of conscience and choice and unresolvable guilt, would continue as long as he lived. The years that followed Germany's surrender transformed Hans from prisoner to employee to something more complicated, a bridge between former enemies who were learning to become allies. He continued flying from Wright Field through 1945 and into 1946, testing aircraft that would define the jet age while Europe rebuilt itself from rubble. But every flight carried the weight of unfinished business, of a mother alive in a devastated country, and a life suspended between two worlds. The letters from Elizabeth came sporadically filtered through military censors and delayed by postal systems that barely functioned. She wrote in careful language, aware that strangers read every word describing life in the displaced persons camp with matter-of-fact brevity that broke Hans's heart more than complaints would have. She had survived Dresden by fleeing to the Elbe riverbank, spending 3 days among thousands of refugees while the city burned. She'd lost everything except a photograph of Hans in his Luftwaffe uniform, which she'd sewn into the lining of her coat. "I keep it to remember who you were," she wrote in August 1945, "not to judge who you've become. A mother's love doesn't require approval, only understanding." Hans read that letter 17 times before he could write a response. Understanding felt like too much to ask when he barely understood himself. Watson noticed the change in him during a debriefing session in September. They'd just completed evaluation flights on a prototype fighter that would eventually become the F-86 Sabre, and Hans had been unusually quiet about his observations. "You're somewhere else today," Watson said, closing his notebook. "I'm thinking about going back to Germany." "You can't, not yet. The occupation zones are still sorting themselves out. Civilians can't just cross borders, and Watson hesitated. "Your status is complicated. My status is that I'm a German citizen who defected and collaborated with an enemy power. If I return, I could be tried for treason. If you return to the Soviet zone, probably. The British or American zones would be safer, but there's no guarantee. Is it worth the risk?" Hans thought about his mother in a camp waiting for a son who might never be able to come home. "She's 63 years old. She survived a firebombing. She's living in a displaced persons camp because her city was destroyed. And I'm here flying jets and collecting American paychecks. You tell me if it's worth the risk." Watson was quiet for a long moment. "Let me make some calls. Maybe we can arrange something through military channels. But Hans, you need to understand that Germany isn't the country you left. It's occupied, divided, starving. Going back won't be like coming home. It'll be like visiting a grave." The arrangements took 4 months. By January 1946, Watson had secured permission for Hans to travel to the American occupation zone as a civilian technical consultant, ostensibly to evaluate captured German aircraft at Oberammergau airfield. The real purpose was unstated, but understood he'd have 2 weeks to find his mother and decide what came next. The flight across the Atlantic was Hans's first time as a passenger since December 1944. He sat in the cargo hold of a C-54 transport surrounded by mailbags and supply crates, watching America disappear behind him and Europe approach with feelings he couldn't name. Anticipation, dread, guilt, relief. All of them simultaneously, none of them adequate. They landed at Rhine-Main Air Base near Frankfurt on January 19th. The Germany Hans saw through the aircraft window was unrecognizable cities reduced to skeletal ruins, roads clogged with refugees, a landscape that looked like the moon rendered in brick and concrete. The devastation he'd contributed to from the safety of an American airfield was now undeniable and immediate. A jeep drove him south toward Leipzig through countryside that alternated between untouched farmland and apocalyptic destruction. They passed through towns where nothing remained but foundations and chimneys, where children played in rubble, and adults moved with the mechanical exhaustion of people who'd survived, but couldn't quite believe it. The displaced persons camp occupied what had been a Wehrmacht barracks. Now it housed 3,000 civilians living in overcrowded dormitory buildings, waiting for countries to accept them or for homes to become habitable again. A harried American administrator checked Hans's papers and directed him to Building 7, 3rd floor, Room 12. Hans climbed stairs that smelled of Jew cabbage and unwashed bodies, his heart hammering harder than it ever had in combat. At Room 12, he knocked twice and waited. The woman who opened the door was his mother, but older than 63 should have made her. Her hair had gone completely white. She'd lost perhaps 30 pounds. But her eyes were the same as the day he'd left for flight training 15 years ago. "Hans," she said, and then nothing else, because she was holding him and he was crying too, and words didn't matter for a long time. They sat on her narrow cot in a room she shared with 3 other women, all of whom had discreetly disappeared when Hans arrived. Elizabeth held his hands like she was afraid he'd vanish if she let go. "You look American," she said, finally studying his civilian clothes, his well-fed face, his clean hands. "You look like someone who hasn't been hungry." "I've been in America. I've been flying. I've been—" Hans stopped, unsure how to explain what he'd been. "I know. The Red Cross told me some of it. A pilot told me more, a Luftwaffe officer who was here briefly. He said you defected. He said you helped the Americans." She squeezed his hands. "He said you were a traitor." Hans felt his throat tighten. "Do you believe that?" "I believe you're alive. I believe you made choices I don't understand. I believe my son is sitting here with me when thousands of mothers have no sons left at all." She touched his face. "I believe the rest doesn't matter." They talked for 6 hours, taking breaks only when emotion made speech impossible. Hans told her about the engine failure that was no failure, about Wright Field and Watson, and the strange twilight of helping former enemies. Elizabeth told him about Dresden burning, about the refugees at the riverbank, about the months in the camp, learning to live with loss that couldn't be quantified. "Do you hate me?" Hans asked, as evening shadows filled the room. "I don't have energy for hate anymore. Hate requires hope that things could have been different. I've accepted that they couldn't." She smiled, thin and sad. "But I don't understand you. I don't understand how you flew for them while they destroyed us." "I flew for them because I couldn't keep flying for what we'd become. Because a regime that murders millions doesn't deserve loyalty, even if it wears your nation's flag." "And the people who died in Dresden, did they deserve what happened?" The question had no answer Hans could give that wouldn't sound like justification. "No, they didn't. Neither did the people who died in the camps. Neither did any of the millions killed by a war none of them chose. But I couldn't stop Dresden. I could only try to end the war faster." Elizabeth looked at him with an expression that held both love and something like pity. "You think you ended it faster? One pilot's defection, one man's cooperation." "I don't know. Maybe not. But I had to believe I was doing something instead of just serving murder and calling it duty." "Then you're braver than I am. Or more foolish. I could never decide which requires more courage, doing what you think is right when everyone says it's wrong, or accepting that right and wrong become meaningless in war." Hans stayed in Germany for 12 days, splitting time between his mother's camp and the aircraft evaluation work at Oberammergau that provided cover for his visit. The juxtaposition was surreal, spending mornings examining captured Luftwaffe jets, spending afternoons among refugees existing in both worlds without truly belonging to either. On his last evening, Elizabeth gave him the photograph she'd saved from Dresden. Hans in his Luftwaffe uniform, young and certain, and untouched by the moral complexities that would come later. "Keep it," she said, "to remember who you were before choices became impossible." "I don't want to remember that person." "Keep it anyway. We don't get to choose which parts of our past we carry. We only get to choose what we do with them." The flight back to America felt longer than the flight to Germany, though the distance was identical. Hans stared at the photograph for hours, trying to recognize the pilot who'd believed in cause and country, who'd flown without questioning what his skill enabled. That person felt like someone else entirely, someone who'd died over Belgium when the engine stopped. Watson met him at Rhine, Maine, before the transatlantic flight. How was it? Like visiting a grave, exactly like you said. Except the grave was still breathing. Will you go back? I don't know. She won't leave Germany. She's too old, too tired, too attached to what's left. And I can't stay. There's nothing there for me except guilt and people who think I'm a traitor. Hans pocketed the photograph. So, I'll keep flying. I'll keep working. And I'll send her money and letters and hope it's enough. It won't be enough. It never is. I know. Hans returned to Wright Field and resumed testing, but something had shifted. He flew with the same skill, but less enthusiasm, as if the sky had lost some of its power to make him forget what waited on the ground. The work continued, evaluating the XB-43 jet bomber, providing consulting on high-altitude aircraft design training, American test pilots in European flight techniques. But it felt increasingly hollow. A technical exercise disconnected from the humanitarian purpose he'd once believed justified his defection. In 1947, the Army Air Forces became the United States Air Force independent from the Army. Hans's contract was renewed under the new organization, his status quietly upgraded from civilian consultant to technical advisor, with security clearances that acknowledged his value while never quite erasing his prisoner of war origins. In 1948, the Berlin airlift began, and Hans found himself briefing Air Force cargo pilots on navigation and weather conditions over Germany. The irony wasn't lost on him, helping Americans supply a German city blockaded by Soviets serving both sides of his heritage, simultaneously existing in the impossible space between former enemies becoming allies. In 1950, as the Korean War began and American jets faced Soviet MiGs, Hans's expertise on enemy aircraft design became relevant again. He briefed fighter pilots heading to Asia, sharing insights that might keep them alive against machines descended from the same technology he'd helped develop. The cycle of war and defection and cooperation repeated with different flags and different aircraft, but the same fundamental calculus knowledge serving survival expertise, transcending allegiance. Watson, now a colonel, found him alone in a hangar one evening in August 1950, staring at an F-86 Sabre being prepped for Korea. "You did this," Watson said, gesturing to the aircraft. "Not alone, but your input shaped the final design. Those swept wings that came from intelligence you provided about German research. The control system modifications. Those came from your flight evaluations. That aircraft exists because you chose to share what you knew. And now it's going to kill people. It's going to keep American pilots alive. Maybe some of them are pilots you briefed 5 years ago. Maybe some of them will survive Korea because they're flying an aircraft improved by your expertise. Does that matter?" Hans thought about the question about the endless chain of cause and effect that made every choice complicit in outcomes no one could fully predict. "I don't know anymore. I used to think knowledge was neutral, that engineering and flying existed separate from politics and war. But knowledge is never neutral. Every blueprint, every flight evaluation, every tactical briefing, it all serves someone's war eventually. So what do you do with that realization? I keep flying, because stopping won't unmake what I've already done. It'll just make it meaningless." Hans continued working for the Air Force until 1952, when personal and professional considerations finally aligned toward a decision he'd been avoiding for years. His mother's health was failing. The camp administrator's letters made that clear. Germany was stabilizing under the Marshall Plan, divided but rebuilding. And Hans was 40 years old, stateless in practice if not in law, tired of living between identities. He resigned from the Air Force on March 15, 1952, 7 years and 3 months after the P-51 flight that had begun his American life. Watson, preparing for retirement himself, hosted a small gathering in a Wright Field conference room, just a dozen test pilots and engineers who'd worked with Hans over the years. There were no speeches, no official recognition, Hans's contribution would remain classified for decades. But as they shared drinks and traded flying stories, there was an acknowledgement of something unprecedented, that enemies could become colleagues, that expertise could bridge ideologies, that loyalty to craft could sometimes transcend loyalty to nations. "Where will you go?" Watson asked as the gathering wound down. "West Germany. Munich, probably. I can consult for aircraft companies there. Maybe work with the new German aviation industry once the occupation authorities allow it. And your mother? I'll bring her to Munich if she'll come. She probably won't. She's too attached to what's left of Dresden, even if Dresden barely exists." Hans finished his drink. "But I need to try. I need to stop choosing flying over people." Watson extended his hand. "It's been an honor working with you, Hans, truly. I know that sounds strange given how this started, but it's true." Hans took the handshake, feeling the weight of 7 years collapse into the grip. "Thank you for treating me like a pilot instead of a traitor, for understanding that defection and betrayal aren't always the same thing." "I think you taught me that, actually." Hans returned to Germany in April 1952, settling in Munich, where he found work with a civilian aviation company, doing exactly what Watson predicted, consulting on aircraft design for an industry trying to rebuild itself. His expertise was valuable, his history was complicated, and the new Germany was pragmatic enough to accept both. He brought his mother to Munich in 1953, installing her in a small apartment near his own. She lived there until her death in 1959, never fully reconciled to what her son had done, but never withdrawing her love because of it. At her funeral, Hans stood alone at the graveside. No other family remained. No friends from her previous life had survived the war, and placed 2 objects in her coffin: the photograph she'd saved from Dresden and his old Luftwaffe pilot's badge that he'd kept hidden for 14 years. "I don't need these anymore," he told the closed casket. "I know who I was. I know who I became, and I know you loved both versions, even when you couldn't understand either." Hans continued working in German aviation through the 1960s, contributing to projects for Messerschmitt Bölkow Blohm and consulting for NATO standardization efforts. He flew as a test pilot until he was 57, finally grounded by age regulations rather than ability. In 1978, 33 years after his defection, American military records were partially declassified, revealing his collaboration with Wright Field and the unprecedented arrangement that had turned an enemy pilot into an American technical advisor. The revelation sparked controversy in both countries. German newspapers called him a traitor. American journals called him a contributor. Hans, retired and living quietly in a Munich suburb, refused all interview requests with a simple statement: "I made choices in war that I believed would save lives. I still believe that. Whether those choices were right or wrong isn't for me to judge. I only know I could not have lived with myself if I'd made different ones." In 1995, at age 83, Hans was invited to speak at the National Museum of the United States Air Force, the institution that had grown from Wright Field. He stood before an audience of historians, pilots, and aviation enthusiasts and spoke for 20 minutes about the nature of loyalty in wartime. "People ask me if I betrayed Germany," he said, his English still accented after 50 years. "I tell them I betrayed a regime that had already betrayed every principle worth defending. People ask me if I became American. I tell them I became a pilot who served peace more than I served any flag. And people ask me if I'd do it again, knowing everything that followed. To that, I can only say, I hope none of you ever face choices where every option feels like betrayal, and you still must choose." The audience sat in silence. Then a man stood in the back row, Colonel Harold Watson, now 86, retired for decades, but still attending aviation events with the dedication of someone whose identity was inseparable from flight. "Permission to speak, Hans. Always, Colonel. You were the best pilot I ever flew with, not the most skilled I've known pilots with better technical ability, but the most honest about what flying meant and what it cost. You taught me that machines are neutral, but the knowledge we carry about them never is. You taught me that expertise is a form of responsibility, not just achievement. And you taught me that sometimes the bravest thing a warrior can do is stop fighting and start thinking. Watson's voice wavered slightly. So from one pilot to another, thank you. For the flights, for the honesty, for the choice you made that day over Belgium. Hans couldn't speak. He nodded once, sharp and precise, a gesture that transcended language. Hans Verner died on March 7, 1997, at age 85. His funeral was held in Munich, attended by aviation engineers, former colleagues, and a handful of American Air Force officers who'd flown from the United States to pay respects. At his request, 2 flags were draped over his casket, German and American symbols of the nations he'd served and betrayed and somehow represented simultaneously. His gravestone bore the inscription his mother had once written to him: "Knowledge should build, not destroy. May his choices be judged by their intentions, not their contradictions." And beneath that, in smaller letters, a line he'd added to his will: Flieger, Mensch, Freund, pilot, human, friend. The sky he'd loved took no sides. It accepted all who came with sufficient skill and courage, regardless of flag or history. In that neutrality, Hans had found something approaching redemption, not forgiveness for what he'd been part of, not absolution for choices made under impossible circumstances, but simply the recognition that loyalty to humanity sometimes requires disloyalty to nations. He'd flown for Germany. He'd flown for America. But ultimately, he'd flown for the belief that engineering genius should serve life rather than death, that knowledge transcends borders, and that the only flag worth true allegiance is the one that values human survival over national pride. History would debate his legacy for decades: traitor or bridge builder collaborator, or peacemaker coward, or conscience. But the pilots who'd flown with him, the engineers who'd learned from him, and the institution that had trusted him with its secrets, knew something simpler. Hans Verner had made the sky a little safer by choosing to share what he knew, rather than taking it to a grave that might have come anywhere over Belgium, over Germany, or in an American test flight gone wrong. He'd chosen knowledge over silence, understanding over ideology, the future over the past. And in doing so, he'd proven that even in war's darkest contradictions, individual conscience could still find a way to serve something larger than its own certainty. If you believe that names like Hans Verner deserve to be remembered not as heroes or villains, but as complex human beings who made impossible choices in impossible times, share this story. And in the comments below, write the name of someone whose moral courage you think history has overlooked. Because the greatest betrayal isn't choosing the wrong side. It's forgetting that sides are made of people, and people deserve to be understood in all their contradictory humanity.